Welcome to Decades of Heistory, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. All right, it is time to go degenerate in Dixie. We're going to see recklessness result in some really bad reckonings. We will see some swift justice delivered in one of our regular haunts, that being Texas. We'll see the results of a dysfunctional family at work in Indiana, Kentucky, and even possibly Florida. We will witness a successful heist in North Birmingham, Alabama, which actually results in the revocation of a pardon. And lastly, we'll see the deadly combination of machine gun, a husband's jealousy, and a forfeited parole at work. All that, January 1927, on Decades of Heistory. We will start off in Texas with, appropriately, the Brownsville Herald from January 19, 1927. This is a front page story. It's titled, simply, Bank Bandit Gets 15 Years. It's subtitled, Hairston Pleads Guilty to Robbery of Bank of Odell. This is out of Vernon, Texas, and it is an AP story. James H. Hairston entered a guilty plea at the opening of the January 19 trial, and not surprisingly, was found guilty of robbery with firearms. The Bank of Odell had been robbed on December 18, 1926, so a month and a day ago. $7,600 was stolen, during which they escaped after locking the cashier and a patron in the vault, which was a standard practice back then. The jury deliberated on Hairston, who had pled guilty, for 15 hours. 1 month and 1 day after the robbery, he was sentenced to 15 years in the 46th District Court. That's swift justice. The defense hadn't indicated at the time if they would appeal. Meanwhile, Clyde Stratton and Leiter Huffman, also indicted, were arraigned for the Odell heist the same day that Hairston pled guilty. Huffman, however, pled not guilty, and his counsel asked for a change of venue. The request was overruled, so the defense asked for a continuance. The request for a continuance was overruled, so the case was called for trial with the selection of jurors to take place after the court reconvened after their noon lunch recess. Again, swift. The Herald continued 2 days later with their January 21st edition with a story titled Bank Bandit Case to Jury. This is the Leiter Huffman story. So the Leiter Huffman defense closed its arguments 2 days later. The case was expected to go to jury that afternoon. That means on the afternoon on the 19th, a jury was selected, and by the afternoon of the 21st, that jury was deciding Leiter Huffman's fate. That's why I said swift justice in Texas. District Attorney O. Franklin was going to present his argument for the state that afternoon, after the defense used, quote, specialists who attempted to show that the defendant was of an unsound mind, the insanity plea. The next day, the 22nd, Leiter Huffman and Clyde Stratton were given 45 years and 15 years respectively. So you heard me right, 45 years for Huffman and 15 for Stratton. Unfortunately, the article didn't explain that disparity. My assumption is that Huffman was the only one who brandished or threatened harm with a firearm, and or his insanity plea backfired and maybe irritated the judge or jury. Hopefully there's more to come, at least for the rationale for the differences in years. I'd like to follow up on that. Otherwise, the Odell robbers story is put to rest. Now we turn to the Indianapolis Times, their January 5th, 1927 edition. This was their second edition front page story, and it is titled Lee Made Terrible Mistake, and it is subtitled Mother of Escaped Convict Mourns Because He Fled. Dysfunction. Quote, my poor boy, he made a terrible mistake in breaking jail this time, end quote. This is from a Mrs. May McIlvaine, who was the mother of Ralph Lee. Now, she was probably a sweet little old lady, but based on what follows, it sounds like there was some serious dysfunction present. I believe she is what today we would call an enabler. Her son had relayed 2 weeks prior to this escape Quote, if they just give me one more chance to go straight, mother, I know I'll make it, end quote. Ralph Lee was an escaped convict. He was awaiting trial for the second-degree murder of an Abner Peake, who was a grocery store worker from Franklin, Indiana. Now, I mentioned that Lee had escaped jail. This December 31st escape was his 11th from jail and his third from the same Franklin County jail alone. Mother McIlvaine had visited Ralph in jail on December 22nd. She brought him a Bible and some homemade jelly. Now, she noted that he was depressed, though whether that meant clinically or he was just melancholic, I don't know. She explained to him that she'd be back the day after Christmas, but then she got sick and she became regretful because had she been able to, quote, see him, he wouldn't have made this terrible mistake, end quote. Quote, he's not a bad boy at heart, the mother said of her ex-convict son wanted for murder. Well, the Indianapolis Times January 18 edition had a page-2 story that really provides quite a twist that yet unresolved. Dying man in Florida may be Ralph Lee, report, was emblazoned across the front page. The title of the story was Man Answering Jailbreaker's Description, Shot During Holdup. It was subtitled Stole Local Car January 1st. It was subtitled Maybe Plainfield Bank Bandit, Another Clue, spelled C-L-E-W for fun. So here are two distinct, separate tracks for Ralph Lee, along with a wild guess. Track 1. 3 bandits held up and robbed the Citizen State Bank at Plainfield, Indiana on Monday afternoon. Now there's a second story that was contiguous, so I'm going to pick up the information and kind of meld it from the second story, which was titled No Clue at Plainfield, subtitled Clean Getaway Made by Bandit Trio. Quote, no trace had been found today of 3 bandits, end quote, who held up Citizen State Bank for between $3,000 and $4,000. So City of Indianapolis and county authorities had searched all the road for clues. The bandits were all described as young. One of the bandits asked a bank employee what time the buses came by, and about the same time a piano salesman from Indianapolis entered the bank. He went over to the bank teller window of Miss Evangeline Cook, who was an assistant cashier, and he was asking just in general about the financial standing of people in Plainfield. I assume he was scoping out who were the people who had big bank accounts because they might be likely to put out some money for a potential piano purchase. But one of the bandits walked over and peered over the piano salesman's shoulder. Quote, I thought he was awfully fresh at the time, end quote, Miss Cook said, which is absolutely reminiscent of how my grandmother spoke, referring to someone as being fresh, being naughty, being impetuous. The salesman left, so another one of the bandits moseyed on over to Miss Cook and asked for $1 worth of nickels. She complied, at which point he drew a revolver, covering her and another assistant cashier named Ralph B. Hornaday. They, along with, quote, a colored woman, end quote, named Della Bryant, who was cleaning the bank, were ordered to lay on the floor. The bandits then scooped up all the cash they could, rifling through money drawers, etc. They forced the 3 victims into the vault, which was locked. Now, a Roy Moore, who was a grocer from across the street, grew suspicious and ended up going into the bank and releasing the people who'd been locked in the vault. At the time, police thought that the bandits had 2 cars, which is kind of an unusual tactic. One they referred to as a Cadillac and the other a Ford. That's track 1 for Ralph Lee. Track 2, we go to Jacksonville, Florida, and Detective Claude M. Worley, who telegraphed that a young man meeting Lee's description had been, quote, probably fatally shot, end quote, while attempting to rob a filling station in Jacksonville. He was currently being held in the detention ward of the city hospital. Now, Worley requested copies of Lee's fingerprints and a description so he could make a better comparison. Indianapolis detectives theorized that Lee may have participated in the Plainfield, Indiana heist because the second assistant cashier declared that one of the robbers was about 18 years old and was only 5 feet tall. Lee was known to appear very youthful and was slight of stature. In addition, police found a stolen Cadillac touring car bearing the license plate that Plainfield citizens said matched that of the fleeing bandit car. Harry Webster, who was superintendent of the Indiana Bankers Protective Department, planned on sending photographs of Lee and other known criminals to Plainfield. In addition, photographs of the Hostetter brothers, who we noted in several 1926 episodes, who were at this time still on the lam, were being sent as well, just to make sure if it wasn't Lee, if they'd actually found one of the Hostetters. Now, that's track 2. Track 3, could it have been both? Could Lee not have participated in an early January robbery of a bank in Plainfield, Indiana, and then hightailed it out of there down to Florida, where he decided to robbed the wrong filling station and now was laying in a hospital bed, probably fatally wounded. So we're definitely going to have to follow up on this story to find out more about Ralph Lee. All right, so this is kind of fun. We get to use the South Bend News-Times for the first time. Their January 8th edition, page 4, using a United Press, UP, just like the AP story. And it is titled, Bandit Gets $44,000 in Alabama Bank Robbery. Go to Birmingham, Alabama, to a short snippet. Apparently on Friday, January 7th, 4 unmasked men held up a bank at Tarrant City, Alabama, which is a suburb on the north side of Birmingham. They locked 4 employees into the vault. On the same day as that paper, the Montgomery Advertiser ran a page 14 story about this robbery that was mixed in with want ads and comics. This was run the same day, but it has more information and more local interest. It was titled, Youthful Bandits Who Held Up Tarrant City Bank Being Sought by Airplanes. We're talking about the Tarrant City Savings Bank and $15,000 that was stolen. So 3 of them entered the bank, 1 remained in the getaway car, and they arrived shortly after the bank opened. Strangely, 1 was masked, 1 was unmasked, and 1 hid his face with his hand. There were apparently 6 employees and 8 customers who were forced at gunpoint to sit on the floor while the doors of the bank were locked. And all the money in sight was raked into little handbags. We had Z.D. McEwen, Herman Cunningham, Mrs. Wilma Williams, Zealand Jacks, and Roberta Griffith as some of the people who were held at gunpoint. Apparently, the customers weren't robbed, supporting the idea that the robbers were stealing the bank's money, not the customer's money. In fact, Ed Fortenberry, who was a customer, had just cashed a $128 check, and the robbers seemed to ignore that. In the end, all 8 customers and 6 employees were forced into the vault to be locked in. Now, a Frank B. Hornsby, manager of the Southern Cereal Company, entered several minutes after the heist and ended up releasing the prisoners from the vault. He actually listened to shouted instructions of a cashier named Nethery. Following the instructions, he was able to open the vault. Bank President W.K. Fonville was not at the bank during the heist. He went and hastily borrowed money to cover the funds that were missing in order to keep the bank open. Pursuers were using all modern equipment, including airplanes, and the robbers were seen heading north out of Tarrant City. So leaving Birmingham and heading north out of Tarrant City. Airplanes from Roberts Field, acting on request of the Tarrant City Mayor T.B. Self, assisted the search by flying low over the roads out of Tarrant City. 100 plus police and deputy sheriffs were scouring the roads. They searched through the night, with police thinking the robbers may have actually doubled back and were hiding somewhere back in Birmingham. Now, the chief of police, Fred H. McDuff, directed a squad of motor scouts and other police to the scene. It was noted that the Tarrant City Savings Bank heist was similar to that of the Security Trust and Savings Company of North Birmingham heist that had been hit back in November 8th. At that point, 5 men entered the bank around noon, robbed the bank and customers of $20,000. So there are some similarities, but there are some major differences. Incidentally, 2 of those 5 were arrested shortly thereafter in Nashville on charges of bank robbery that had taken place there in Tennessee. Now, here's where the revocation of a pardon comes into play. The Wednesday, January 12th Montgomery Advertiser ran a story titled Shouse Denies Robbery Charge, subtitled Claims Employed in Mobile at Time Birmingham Bank Held Up. So we head to Mobile, Alabama. Quote, "They got me wrong," end quote, said Herbert Strauss. Now, he was being held as a suspect in the Birmingham bank heist. He'd been arrested by Chief Deputy Wade. Strauss, whose name was also noted as Strauss, Strouse, and Shrouse. His name is misspelled at least twice. Strauss claimed that he was working as a taxi driver for a Charles Nelson. In fact, Nelson came to the jail upon Strauss's arrest and verified his alibi. Nelson even had what they called trip sheets, proving that Strauss was working long before the Birmingham heist. Here's the reason they suspected him. Strauss did admit that he'd been sentenced to serve 6 years for a similar offense and was currently on parole. In fact, he even had his parole papers on him when he was arrested. It sounds like he was trying to go straight. The next day's Montgomery Advertiser had a story titled Brandon Revokes Shous's Parole and subtitled Montgomery Man to Re-Enter Penn, Score of Prisoners Paroled and Pardoned. In one of our quick hitter stories from the previous video, the January 1927 Part 3 video titled Heist to Heartbreak, we noted Governor W. Brandon's last day in office was January 17th, and we saw a pardon and parole-a-palooza. In fact, we noted that 5 of the 9 receiving the governor's largesse were violent criminals. Upon learning of the arrest of Strauss, Governor Brandon revoked the parole granted to Strauss back on May 5th, 1926. Well, a similar list of those receiving new pardons and paroles followed that story and included violators of Prohibition law and those who made or distilled liquor, but also went to the other extreme to a host of more violent criminals ranging from manslaughter in the first to murder in the second degrees. For now, Strauss, however you spell it, is on the hook for the Tarrant City, Alabama heist. We will follow up in the coming months to find out if Strauss was in fact innocent and he's released, or he was guilty and returns to jail for a longer sentence. For some recklessness, we turn to the Evening Star, January 17, to a story titled Machine Gun Used in Convict Escape, subtitled Jealousy of Wife Blamed in Flight of Slayer with Parole Near, and the New Britain Herald as well. Both papers ran similar AP stories. The New Britain Herald's was titled Escaped Convict is Fully Armed, subtitled Oklahoma Gunman Has 4 Pistols and Machine Gun. For that, we are going to turn to Tulsa, Oklahoma. All right, so who are we talking about? We're talking about 29-year-old John Mayo. He'd been convicted of robbing a bank in Kansas and was sentenced to 21 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. And he was a key witness in the Hale Ramsey Indian murder trial. This once again brings us back to, of all places, Oklahoma, and once again brings us back to something we've covered in the past, the Osage Reign of Terror. So the what? He escaped the Tulsa County Jail. When? Apparently Sunday, January 19th. The big question is how. He somehow acquired 4 pistols and a machine gun and locked his 2 guards in a cell. So here's how it sort of broke down. There was a search for Mayo around Vinita, Oklahoma, which is northeast of Tulsa and the area of his former home. Deputy sheriffs were confident that he planned on seeing his wife because they think that the reason Mayo escaped was due to his jealousy of her. And they added that they feared taking him alive was unlikely. Now, sadly, and probably demonstrative of either an immature or irrational mindset, Mayo was close to parole. He'd previously been in Oklahoma City following the trial of W.K. Hale, who was a wealthy cattleman, and John Ramsey, who was a cowboy/farmer. They'd been convicted in the federal court and sentenced to life for the murder of Henry Roan, Osage Indian. This is part of the Osage Reign of Terror Indian murders when around 12 wealthy Indians were killed. This is a whole nother story. It's way more than 12. Some people think it's as many as 100 or hundreds. The reason was oil rights that were given to the owners of the land that some people would call reservation, other would call nation. It's a very complicated story, but the Osage Reign of Terror involved horrific poisonings, just vicious murders. And in many cases, it was done in such a cavalier way because some of the people involved didn't consider the Indians as fully human. As it turns out, Mayo was a witness for the government, meaning he turned state's witness in today's parlance. Apparently, Hale had asked Mayo to blow up the home of N.E. Smith, which I believe is actually W.E. Smith. The paper reported it as N.E. Incidentally, Smith's home was indeed later blown up, but Mayo denied involvement. In the language of the day, people who were bomb experts or were able to blow things up were called soup man. I've included a link for the UMKC site that has a thorough description, has amazing photographs. What's interesting is that Mayo is not mentioned once in that very long article. However, Blackie Thompson, someone we have met way in the past and mentioned numerous times because of the nickname Blackie, was noted, albeit in a bit role. In addition to the UMKC site, I added another one for True West magazine, which has a great photo of Irvin Blackie Thompson and a reference to the movie that was made about this saga called Killers of the Flower Moon. Unbelievably to me, Mayo had submitted an application for pardon, and it was due to be signed by none other than President Calvin Coolidge 1 week after he escaped. That is just irrational behavior. He may have been under the impression that it wasn't going to go through, but still, the chance that it could. So why was he eligible? Well, Mayo had become a trustee in the jail and had been extended unusual privileges. When Mayo confronted the 2 jailers that he later locked in a cell, they remonstrated him, reminding him his parole was imminent. Highly focused or blinded by ignorant jealousy, he ignored them, forced the lock on the jail armory, and acquired 2 additional pistols and a machine gun, and then locked the 2 jailers into a cell or the bullpen where the guards stay secured with a view of the prisoners, depends on the source. Mayo left the jail, got into a taxi, and went to a hotel where his wife and 11-year-old son were staying. He burst into the room and shouted, quote, "Where is he?" End quote. Mayo somehow had heard that a man had been, quote, attentive, end quote, to his wife because Mayo hadn't received pardon or was unlikely to get a pardon. Well, in reply to his question, there was no he in the room. So he rushed into an adjoining room where a W.C. Holt, who was a garage employee, was lodged. Mayo left the door open and then promptly threatened to kill Holt, according to Mayo's wife. Holt was unarmed, so Mayo told him he had 3 hours to scram out of town or he'd shoot him, to which Holt fled. Somehow, shortly before Mayo had escaped jail, he had promised a reporter a, quote, wild story. He noted that, quote, "When I was 17 when I robbed my first bank, it netted me $30,000, end quote. Another quote, he said, "I had all the money in the world, it seemed to me, and it went like water. When I get out of here, I'm going straight." And we heard the "I'm going straight" thing from Ralph Lee as well. Anyway, the Brownsville Herald picked up the story with Oklahoma jailbreaker caught. So allegedly he, quote, terrorized guests at the local hotel. So that's additional information. Presumably with his shouting, threatening to kill Holt, and probably just general ill, violent, aggressive behavior. 2 stories away from all this information about Mayo was a one-line story titled "Bandits Loot Bank." Coincidentally, it took place in Oklahoma, Wayne, Oklahoma, when 2 men held up and robbed the First State Bank, and they escaped with $2,500. Now, I'm not attributing this heist to Mayo, as he was probably occupied with his recent freedom and fighting with his wife. But I am going to add it to the tracker, and we'll update as more information becomes available. It's highly unlikely, but it's possible that he actually found the time to rob this bank as well. Well, apparently, Mayo had arranged for a reporter from the newspaper The Tulsa World to meet him at a cabin. During the interview, Mayo related that he would never submit to capture, which is ironic because the next story we have is titled "Escaped Convict is Again in Jail." Subtitled, "Fears that Husband Might Hold Up Bank Cause Capture of John Mayo." Well, I smell a rat. It seems that the, quote, woman's fear that her husband, a paroled convict, might hold up a bank or something, end quote, led to the capture of Mayo. But it wasn't Mayo's wife. John Mayo and Nat Green, the husband referenced above, were both arrested in the old cabin in the rough Osage County hills of Oklahoma. The woman who feared in question was Mrs. Nat Green. Apparently, she'd been trying to find her husband, who she correctly assumed was with John Mayo. Well, at 2 a.m., Sheriff Sanford and a posse surrounded the old cabin. They entered the building and found Mayo standing behind a bedroom door. Quote, "All right, Johnny," end quote, said Sheriff John Sanford while aiming a revolver at Mayo. "All right, Bob," replied Mayo. "You've got me. No trouble." Then Mayo put up his hands, thereby dropping a bundle which included 2 of the revolvers he'd taken from jail. The automatic rifle, aka the machine gun, was found on the bed under a pillow. Quote, "Now, Johnny," said Sheriff John Sanford as he took Mayo into custody for the return trip to Tulsa, quote, "We've got no handcuffs with us, and we trusted you once. If you try to get away, you know what that means," end quote. To which Mayo simply nodded. So I assume we're not going to hear back about the Texas robbers, but definitely hope to learn about Ralph Lee. The youthful Alabama robbers seem to be on a bit of a tear, which will end one way or another. And then our dear friend who we just met, John Mayo, with his inability to control his emotions, is probably going down for a long, long time. We will see in the months ahead with our follow-ups, but for now, it's on to February 1927. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of Heistory. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird.